We established in episode 1 that God needs nothing. Not your performance, not your compliance, not your silence. That single fact dismantles the architecture of obligation most spiritually harmed people were handed. A God who needs nothing cannot be threatened. A God who cannot be threatened has no reason to demand you to stay small. But that raises a harder question. If God needs nothing from you, why does he ask for anything at all? Welcome to God is My Guru. There's a particular kind of religious damage that is almost impossible to explain to someone who hasn't experienced it. It is not the damage of being told God doesn't exist. That would have been cleaner, easier to locate, easier to argue with, easier to leave behind. This is the damage of being told God does exist and that he's watching and that he's keeping score and leaving you with the feeling that the score is not in your favor. It's the damage of learning very early that love and threat can occupy the same sentence. That the person who says, I love you, is the same person who tells you what God will do if you get it wrong. That you are, apparently, getting it wrong constantly. What forms in a child under those conditions is not faith. It's a survival response. And survival responses are extraordinarily difficult to distinguish from the real thing, because they feel the same from the inside. They look the same from the outside. They use the same vocabulary. They show up at the same buildings on the same days. But they're not the same thing. Ordinary harm leaves you with an injury and a person to attribute it to. You can, in time, separate yourself from that person, grieve the injury, and rebuild on different ground. Spiritual abuse recruits God into the injury. It does not merely hurt you in God's name, it restructures your understanding of reality so that God becomes the source and guarantor of the harm. The person delivering it is just a messenger. Above them, endorsing it, requiring it on a cosmic scale, is God, which means there's nowhere to go. You cannot leave God the way you can leave a person. You cannot grieve God and rebuild. You cannot put distance between yourself and God without that distance feeling like exactly the kind of rebellion you were told would cost you everything. The trap is elegant in the worst possible way. And it means that many people who describe losing their faith did not lose their faith at all. They fled a structure that had become unbearable. They could not live inside that version of God any longer and remain themselves. So they left. That's not faithlessness. That is sanity. And leaving didn't fix it. That's the part nobody warns you about. You got out, you built a life, and the thing still lives inside you. In how you react when someone mentions religion, in what happens in your body when you hear certain music, in why you can't fully explain to your partner why you react to certain things and can't go to a wedding in a particular kind of building. You left, it didn't leave you. So if everything you learned, everything they said was true, is wrong, if what you were handed was never actually God, then what is there left to stand on? For many people, that doesn't feel like liberation. It feels like falling. Admitting it was wrong also feels like betrayal of the people who handed it to you. But most of them didn't know. They were handed the same thing. They were surviving it too. You understand that part. But it just adds to it being hard to heal. And some of you stopped altogether, not because you stopped caring, but because you cared so much for so long and it was never enough. So you let it go, maybe all of it. If you can get past the hurt that was done to you and look at what the source material says, I'll help you discover something that most people shaped by religious harm were never shown. In Deuteronomy 6:4-5, you will read the command Jesus called the greatest. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. This is called the Shema, and I will reference it as that. So God is commanding love. How can you command love? That in itself is an oxymoron. If you grew up being told to feel grateful when you didn't, to feel loved when you didn't, to perform an internal state you didn't have and be punished for the gap, then a command to love God sounds like more of the same. I know, that sounds like more of the same, like we just swap one performance for another. You have already done that. You smiled when you weren't happy. You prayed when you weren't heard. You performed devotion while something inside you was dying. You know what pretending costs. If something in you went quiet and guarded the moment I mentioned scripture, that's not a problem. That's information. It means the words were used against you enough times that your nervous system learned to treat them as a threat. You don't have to override that. Just notice it and keep listening if you want to. God is not asking you to fake love. He's not standing at the door with a clipboard. He's asking you to stop faking everything else and decide what you're moving toward. That sounds simple until you realize how much of your life was built on pretending. If you were told you were wrong even when you were right, bad even when you were kind, and at some point the only sane response is to stop playing a game you cannot win, to choose the thing you were already being accused of, at least then it's yours. That is not depravity. That is a person trying to survive with some dignity intact. And underneath it, almost always, is one unanswered question. Can you love me as I actually am? This is why I want to show you what the Shema is actually saying, and this changes everything. You were never able to fake love for God. That's the part of you that refused to perform when everything around you was performing. But you never became neutral either. Even the anger was directed at Him. Even walking away was a response to Him. You don't protest someone who means nothing to you. So the conflict was never between loving and not loving. It was between something that still responds and a trust that was destroyed. Believe it or not, those are not the same thing. The Shema doesn't ask you to resolve that first. It asks you to stop splitting yourself around it, to stop holding that part of you hostage to what was done in His name. The love and the broken trust are both real. Bring both. That's where this begins. If you were hurt by people who acted like they had God's backing, people who performed righteousness while treating you as invisible or as a target, it was not your fault. The people who performed religion, who showed up, brought offerings, said the right words, but whose hearts were turned elsewhere, God saw them. Whatever they told you about His backing, they were wrong. That might be the first time you heard that said plainly, without qualification, without someone softening it into something more comfortable. If the people who hurt you did it under His name, He saw that. He was not endorsing it. He was not on their side. I know some of you are thinking, but mine is still out there, still preaching, never apologized. That is a real and separate weight. And I will go into it in another episode because it deserves a whole episode. But it doesn't change who God saw or whose side He was on. They had neither feeling nor actions shaped according to God's way. You can orient towards something outwardly while moving away from it inwardly. You can perform the direction without walking it. You can, in short, claim love and contradict it entirely with how you live. In Isaiah 1, God is speaking to His own people, the religious ones, the ones showing up, bringing offerings, maintaining the forms. And He says, "Stop bringing meaningless offerings. Your incense is detestable to me." This is not God rejecting ritual because He finds it boring. The people bringing these offerings had become systematically unjust. The vulnerable in their society are being crushed, while the religious performance continues without interruption. God's objection is not the offering themselves. It is to the hands bringing them. Hands that are as Isaiah put it elsewhere in the same chapter, covered in the blood of the people they have failed. The religion was still running, the relationship had collapsed entirely. Hosea 6 makes the same accusation with a different image. God describes the repentance of his people as morning mist, here before sunrise, gone before anyone noticed. He says, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, and acknowledgement of God rather than burnt offerings. He's not saying sacrifice is wrong. He's saying, what you're bringing me is not connected to anything real inside of you. It evaporates the moment the service ends. And what I am actually looking for, mercy, acknowledgement, orientation that survives contact with real life, that is nowhere to be shown. He doesn't say, you didn't give me enough. He says, you forgot. He doesn't require that much from you. He doesn't need anything, remember? Micah 6:8 says that God requires 3 things: to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Justice, mercy, humility. Notice what is not on that list: attendance, volume, performance, the appearance of correctness, the silencing of questions, the smallness that certain religious systems require of people in order to function. If you left, or if you are still inside something that has hurt you, or somewhere in between, carrying what was handed to you because you never had a chance to examine it, then the question is not if God is real. The question is, what were you actually given? Because if what you were given was a God who needed your silence, your terror, your unquestioning compliance, a God who was essentially a larger and more cosmic version of the authority that harmed you, then what you are carrying is not described in the Bible. Which means what God is building toward is not a population of compliant subjects. It is something else entirely. Let us look at how God deals with anger, us being angry with him. You heard the Jonah story in the last episode, but what most people remember is the whale. What matters is the ending. After 3 days in the whale, Jonah delivers the message. Nineveh repents. God relents. And as you also probably remember, Jonah is furious with God. His complaint is extraordinary. I knew that you were gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abounding in love, a God who relents from sending calamity. That is why I fled in the first place. He knew before he ran. He knew God would do exactly this. He didn't want Nineveh spared. He wanted them destroyed. And now that they haven't been, he tells God he would rather die than watch it. God doesn't strike him down, withdraw from him, or respond with the kind of severity that Jonah, by every religious standard, deserves. Not for the rebellion, not for running in the first place, not for the explicit refusal, not for this furious confrontation, this direct statement that Jonah knew better and wanted something different. Instead, God asks him a question. Is it right for you to be angry? He doesn't answer the question for Jonah, he asks it, which means the anger isn't immediately classified, condemned, or managed. It's just given space to exist. Asked about rather than shut down. That is not what you were shown. You were shown anger, suppressed, redirected, labeled rebellion. This is different. This is someone who can handle being told the truth about how you feel. Jonah storms off to sulk under a shelter and watch to see if anything will happen to the city. And God provides shade. He lets a plant grow overnight. Jonah is grateful for it. The next day it withers. Jonah is furious again, furious enough to die over a plant. And God uses the plant. He says, "You cared about this plant that you didn't tend or grow, that appeared overnight and died overnight. Should I not care about Nineveh?" He doesn't argue Jonah into submission. He asks him to see his point of view. He doesn't overpower him theologically. He uses a plant to open a door. That is not the portrait of God most spiritually harmed people were handed. This pattern, patience, then judgment only after every alternative is exhausted, runs through the whole Old Testament. Noah preached for decades before the flood. Abraham interceded for Sodom, and God sent angels to investigate. Judgment came only when no righteous remained. The severity of those events doesn't erase the patience that came before them. The flood and Sodom are not exceptions. They are the end of a long, patient road. A God who sits with an angry, disobedient, sulking prophet and asks questions rather than delivering verdicts. That is a God worth looking at again, without the frame someone else put around him. So, justice, mercy, and humility, and walking humbly with your God. Does any of these benefit God? He needs nothing, as we said. All three of them transform the person practicing them and change the lives of the people around them. What you are carrying was painted by people operating from fear, from need, from their own unresolved damage, using God's name as the frame. The God in the text asks questions of the people who are furious with him. He waits centuries before judging. He tells Moses, "I need nothing from you." He desires mercy over performance, acknowledgement over ritual, orientation over appearance. He builds towards something in people across time that has nothing to do with keeping them small. And sometimes there was a moment, maybe more than one, where something in you said, "This isn't right." Not the theology, not the doctrine, but the gap between what was being said and what was actually happening. You felt it. You might have been 12, you might have been 7. You noticed the gap and you knew, even then, that noticing it was dangerous. So you went quiet. You performed. You survived. You didn't stop loving God. You stopped trusting what came in His name. What do you do with the part of you that knew? That's going to be in the next episode.